So did it work? Well, Simon Wesley and his collaborator Edgar Jones have argued that it didn't, and this has made them very unpopular with the military establishment because the whole rationale of military psychiatry is that it sends men back into battle. And if it can't do that, what's the point of having military psychiatrists? Anyway, that was but at the time, the feeling was that it did work. Now, I can only talk very briefly about methods of treatment at home. The most important of these that I'm going to mention was a form of psychotherapy which drew on the writings of Pierre Janet, the French psychiatrist who was more important than Freud to this generation of British doctors. Janet had worked with simple serving girls who had had traumatic experiences using hypnosis. And the rationale of this is that when you've had a traumatic experience, you consign it to, as it were, the attic of your mind. You hide it away. And the rationale of this method of treatment was that you brought it back under hypnosis and then you reconciled it. This hidden memory was then reconciled with conscious working memory. And big arguments about this, forget the names, I can't go into them, but big arguments about whether it worked, and if it did work, why it worked. And essentially, the one school of thought said it's an intellectual process whereby you reconcile these things in the mind. The second school of thought said, no, what you're doing here is you're bringing out the trapped emotion. It's about emotion, the affect. You're bringing that out. It's a cathartic process, and that's what makes people better. And in the Second World War, William Sargent took this one stage further and said, it doesn't even matter if it was experience that they actually had. If you just get the emotion out, they'll be cured. And I'm going to cut the next slide because it's too complicated for this context. Another element here in the medical argument is, I said that we had a physical stage, a psychological stage. We now come to the physiological stage. Before the First World War, a Harvard physiologist called Walter Bradford Cannon had conducted these experiments of his own and reviewed an enormous literature to show what happens when animals are exposed to fear over long periods of time. And this centered on the role of the endocrine system, and this is very much has been the focus of modern research on PTSD. The curious thing about this is it didn't really lead to new treatments, and arguably it hasn't today. Simon will tell you more about that. But this was certainly, by the end of the First World War, this was the line, the most prominent line in medical research, because it was the line which seemed best to describe people who'd been right the way through the war and then finally could take it no more. The rationale here is that the body mobilizes itself in these situations for fight or flight. And if you're trapped in the trenches and you can neither fight nor flight, or flee, if you just sit there, supine, being bombarded, then your body is in the state of mobilization, but it never gets the chance to express itself, express all this trapped chemicals, and therefore this is what produces the symptoms. A few famous cases which you'll know about. Siegfried Sassoon. Did he have shell shock or did he have an anti-war complex? He went to Craig Lockhart, he had chats with Rivers, his dreams were talked about, and he played golf, and in the end he was sent back to the front line by Rivers because Rivers felt that was the best thing to do. Now, Wilfred Owen was also at Craig Lockhart, and the interesting thing about Wilfred Owen was that he wasn't treated by Rivers, who was the big dream man. He was treated by a man called Brock, who was into ergotherapy, the cure through work, a Scottish madman he was, but a very effective therapist. And this is why Owen wrote about his dreams in his poems and didn't talk about them to his therapist, which is what he would have done had Rivers been his therapist. Now, Nigel Osborne knows far more than I about Ivor Gurney, so I won't say anything about him. Social support. I'm going to just remind you that they didn't necessarily see this in them days as we do now. Shell shock was perceived as a disorder of the will as well as of function. And so you get people saying things like, nothing impedes recovery so much as flying visits of unthinking but kindly intentioned philanthropic lady visitors. That was Sir John Colley, expert on malingering. Harold Crichton Miller founded the Tavistock Clinic, hated rival of Simon's Maudsley, And Harold Crichton Miller was the leading psychotherapist of the day. And he said, shell shock produces a condition which is essentially childish and infantile in its nature. Rest in bed and simple encouragement is not enough to educate a child. Progressive daily achievement is the only way whereby manhood and self-respect can be regained. Who breaks down? Big argument here. Who is actually breaking down? And at the one end of the spectrum, you have Elliott Smith and pair who said the war has shown that anybody can break down if the environment is bad enough, and therefore the pessimistic appeal to heredity, which is the basis of asylum medicine at this time, you must move beyond that pessimistic appeal to heredity. On the other hand, Millais Calpin, very nice, sympathetic man, said it was soon realized by those who treated these patients that a large number had suffered from symptoms before enlistment. He thought 57%, others thought more, and Calpin thought that 10%, quotes, drifted into hospital on the strength of their previous symptoms. Nothing to do with the war. There were many postscripts to shell shock, one in 1922. I'm going to talk briefly about one in 1939. They gathered all the doctors together because the Germans were going to come and bomb the civilian population of London, and what on earth were they going to do about it? And a lot of the people like Rivers were dead, but some of the psychiatrists and psychologists associated him were there, and curiously enough, everybody took the same line. It was decided that in the war to come, you should not give it a medical name. You should not call it shell shock. You should call it exhaustion. You should not medicalize it. Secondly, there should be no psychotherapy. A very distinguished psychotherapist called Ross went around urging nurses not to provide psychotherapy. And thirdly, there should be no pensions. And this was slightly changed later on. And I would like you to realize that this is how the British fought the Second World War, with some success, you can argue. Okay, I'm going to conclude with my tuppence worth on the subject of this conference, which is the relationship between music and war. And this is a short quotation from a story which appeared in Penguin New Writing in 1943. It was called The Crew of the Jackdaw, and it's about two North Sea trawlers racing for port in wartime. And as they're racing for port, one of these North Sea trawlers hits a mine and blows up. And the crew of the Jackdaw watch as through the air fly bits of ship and bits of man. And they have to stop, and they fish around and retrieve what they can out of the water. And this is all sitting on the deck of the ship. And the narrator realizes that this is upsetting the crew. I saw the boys' faces standing there by the wheelhouse looking, and I said, "You bastards had better sing." And I began to sing the Rose of Tralee that I always like. And Styx came in with me, and the little cook that we call the Duke, because his name is Wellington, he joined in. After that, we had Roll Out the Barrel, and then the stoker pipes up with, "I'm the man that makes the smoke come out of the lum choo choo." And we followed that with, "They all get on to the Farman when the ship is very slow." And we were singing fine, with never a hymn to make us sad when we came in between the pierheads. And when they came into port, this rather gruesome sight was all removed. And after that, we had our sheggy, and that was well laced with rum. Yes, they must have drained the bloody jar to make it that way. I slept good after it. Thank you.